Hi everyone, this is Mr. Trio again, and today we're looking at paper number 2, Historical Investigations, and this presentation focuses on tackling C-type questions. This type of question is usually framed, how far do you agree with this interpretation? And for the purposes of this video and for students of history, interpretation is not translation into a different language, which is the way that interpretation usually appears in our everyday lives. But interpretation essentially means the historian's point of view of an event of history. This video focuses on any of the topics that are part of the paper 2 investigation. However, the case study that we will be using for the presentation is the A2. The most important element of this particular question is extract C, which is provided in the paper. Now, what are some of the things that you should expect from extract C? The first is that it's always from a historian, and it's written after the fact. And in theory, the historian has studied this period, has looked at many different sources, including views of other historians, and essentially has come up with a point of view or interpretation, as it's referred to. The other thing which is important to keep in mind is that the extract is always related to source A and B from the B question. So in theory, you've just finished answering the B question. When you get to the C question, the topic will be the same. And for the C answer, you have to use sources A and B again. We'll get into that when we look at our example. The extract will also indicate who and when it was published. The reason why this is important is that interpretations of historians change over time. So if this is a very old interpretation, there may be certain interpretations which are more modern, if you will. I just mentioned this, however, at the IGCSE level, this is probably something you don't have to think about too much. And lastly, with the extract, it's never neutral. The historian definitely has a point of view. They may provide evidence that contradicts their point of view. However, most of the information in the extract points in one direction or another. This is the marking scheme for the C question. And one of the first things that I'll mention is that it has more moving parts than a Swiss chronograph. I mean, this is a little complicated. It's 16 marks, obviously, and there are different marks for different sections. The most important, I guess, is that 10 marks go to understanding those sources and specifically cross-referencing the sources. And up to 6 marks is through your analysis and evaluation of the historical interpretation. Let's look at it from 4 basic bullet points. And that is that you have to provide an evaluation that provides an alternative point of view than the historian. You have to show how your analysis supports the differences. You also need to go beyond what the sources and the extracts say. So this in a C question is not only what do sources A and B say, but what also can you add to the conversation that can help support the argument or disprove the argument. And then finally, and we'll have a special section in this presentation about overall judgment. The third paragraph of your essay is essentially where you have to make a clear and logical argument of how you agree with the historian or if you disagree. You have to go one way or the other. You just can't say that you somewhat agree with the historian. You should definitely give a certain point of view. So just as a reminder, in answering this question, you have to use your own knowledge. You have to use the information from source A, source B, and the extract. as I mentioned, with so many moving parts, the most important thing that you need to do is spend a little time with a throwaway piece of paper in order to lay out a plan. And one way to think about this is that you should begin with what is the extract's interpretation, and then look at source A. How does source A agree with this interpretation? How does it disagree? Do you have any particular knowledge that would help to agree or disagree with this point of view? And then you have to do the same thing with the source B. So essentially, your first paragraph will be about source A. The second paragraph will be about source B. And it all points back to that extract, what the historian's interpretation is. Now, as I mentioned, you should come up with a plan. If you have a plan in place, then essentially you can follow that plan throughout your 2 paragraphs. And what that plan essentially is what I call argument. Restate what the interpretation of the historian is. Then get into the evaluation, cross-referencing the first source against that argument. How does it agree? How does it disagree? In some cases, you also have to bring in more information that will give more context to the argument. And then finally, with source A, can you come up with an alternative evaluation? And does source A support it or perhaps not support it? There's a lot in this paragraph, and we'll look at an example in just a minute. But the main thing that I hope that you do for this C question is stick to a pattern. Whatever pattern you come up with, that's fine. But the worst thing that you can do on the day of examination is try to create your essay from whole cloth. If you start with a plan and a pattern and follow that, then it really just comes down to the information that you need to put into it, opposed to trying to figure out the analysis at that time. As a reminder, we're going to be looking at the sample from our B type question video. So we're going back to these 2 friends, the commander from the White Army, and then the Bolshevik leader, Victor Serge. And then extract C, this is when we've finally get to look at an example. In this particular example, you might notice that it comes from a modern world history published in 1996. So that's a few years away. Maybe that's relevant, maybe it's not. And I've made the text a little larger so you can see it here. Extract C suggests that the main reason for the Bolshevik victory in the Civil War was the weakness of the whites. Now, believe me when I tell you, this is what the historian's point of view is. They're not trying to trick you. So use this argument as you compare it to source A, your own knowledge, and use this argument when you compare it to source B and your own knowledge. So, as I said before, I like to follow this plan of argument, evaluation, and alternative evaluation. And we can go through this particular essay. This is a good time to pause the video if you want to read it in complete form. But the main thing that I hope you recognize is that I'm breaking this response into those different sections. I'm only focusing on source A in the first paragraph and comparing it with the extract, and I am providing my own information and also an alternative. By the way, in this particular alternative evaluation, what I'm stating is that it's not just necessarily the weakness of the whites that could be an argument, but also that the Bolsheviks were stronger and had better leadership. No surprise, when you get to the second paragraph, focus on source B and apply it in the same way. How does source B support the weakness of the whites? Just like the historian said. And then, can you apply source B to your own alternative evaluation about the Bolsheviks being a stronger group? So that takes care of paragraph 1 and 2. And I just have it down here. Once again, you can pause if you want to read it. I would never suggest that I'm an expert when it comes to this particular topic, but I tried to read the sources in the extract and come up with a plausible sort of evaluation and counter-evaluation. Now we need to focus on the overall judgment. This is your third and the final paragraph where you can perhaps get those extra marks that will get you into the high levels. How do we come up with an overall judgment that's justified and logical? Well, once again, I go back to my old friend's second order concepts like change, significance, and consequence. You can essentially apply these types of concepts in order to show that one argument is stronger than the other. And just as a reminder, the argument that the historian makes is that the whites were weak. The counter-arguments was the Bolsheviks were stronger. So, once again, here is my third paragraph. The main thing that I want you to look at is how I apply extract C into the second order concept. This argument is based on the consequence of the whites' actions. Their cruelty and disrespect showed that the local level was a stronger motivator for ordinary people supporting the Bolshevik movement than the socialist message. It is also important to consider the leadership of individuals like Lenin and Trotsky was significant. Or in other words, what I tried to do in this last paragraph is state very clearly that the main reason for the Bolshevik victory was the weakness of the whites. And then I tried to apply that second order concept of consequence. And then, in order to give it a more justified point of view, I also talk about the counter-argument and apply a second order concept of significance. I hope that this video has been helpful. As a reminder, there are lots of great resources from Pearson that are available for download on the Pearson website. Use this QR code in order to do so. Once again, this video should be seen with the previous video on how to answer the B question because they're so closely linked. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that this video has been helpful.